morning, everyone. Welcome to another masterclass with KZN Top Business. This morning, I have Colette Tanner from DRG. She's the operations director there. And our topic this morning is harassment in the workplace. And just to give a brief outline, Colette has had more than 20 years experience in human resources. And one of her passions is working with people and getting to know people and adding value to organization. And I think people really make companies tick. So to talk a bit more about adding value and how we can get the workplace going smoothly, I'm going to not add anymore, but hand over directly to Colette. Thanks so much, Colette, for joining us today.
I'm going to share my screen with the presentation now. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. It's actually a very interesting topic, and so often people are saying why now and where's this coming from, and the Code of Good Practice was gazetted in March. And it punts really an awareness and bringing an awareness of harassment and sexual harassment prevention and elimination in the workplace. And really that's our point of departure. We really need to create an environment in our workplace free of harassment and free of sexual harassment, and do everything as an organization to prevent, eliminate and create an environment of zero tolerance. So the Code of Best Practice is actually born out of the Employment Equity Act, and we will cover where and how this has brought about. But in terms of the objectives of what we really want to cover, so we want to eliminate, in line with local regulations, harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace, to create an environment of zero tolerance. We obviously, as organizations, want to be able to provide our people with a procedure to follow and to deal with. How do we deal with this? So someone has alerted me on a matter that they're dealing with. What do I do? Where do I go? And we need to make that accessible to our people. And also we want to encourage and promote the development and implementation of policies and procedures that will create a workplace free of harassment and sexual harassment. And that's very important. And you'll see this right the way through the presentation. I just want to, just in a nutshell, try and demystify the code. And this is quite a nice sort of summary of really what we're looking at. I'm just going to move my picture over slightly. So what is sexual harassment? What is harassment? So it is the direct or indirect, could be a single or repeated conduct that is unwanted, unwelcome. How do we know, and we'll go through this, how do we know that it's unwelcome, unwanted? Has it been communicated to the perpetrator, or should the perpetrator have known that his or her conduct was generally considered unacceptable? And this is against a person or a group or a community, which can be vertical or horizontal. And these terms are really, is it on the same level, colleague to colleague? Is it a line manager to an employee? Is it an employee to a line manager? And then, so what is dignity? It creates an environment that becomes intolerable, certainly over time if it's not dealt with. It is conduct that is related to arbitrary or prohibited grounds, which we'll cover in terms of what the Employment Equity Act sees this as. it also has a negative impact on the ability to work, the personal well-being. And that's what we return to, is what is the impact on the complainant? What is the impact on the employee, the individual that is being harassed? How is this affected the performance, the well-being of the individual? And you know, how are we dealing with this in terms of the greater part of our business, and who does business with us, and what is the company's stance in terms of protecting its employees or people who the business does business with? And then we see, of course, what are these prohibited grounds? And our Employment Equity Act, Section 6.1 says that it's race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, family responsibility, ethnic or social origin, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, HIV status, conscious belief, your political opinion, culture, language, birth, or any other similar arbitrary ground. So this conduct can be, this bad behavior or this offensive behavior can be either physically, a physical attack, can be verbally, someone has said something offensive to you, or you've heard something, a rumor happening in the background. It's a hostile environment being created, teasing. It can also be psychological and emotional abuse, slandering, malicious rumors being spread, work processes being held back to almost sabotage your performance or have you perceived as not performing, and also can be a passive aggressive in terms of a snide joking in the back end, sort of a slipping a joke in here or there, sarcasm, sort of a facial expression, condescending behavior. So when we look at two, who is the victim and the perpetrator? So who does this affect? These are your owners, employees, managers, supervisors, can be your interns, volunteers, suppliers, clients, anyone that has dealings within your business. And what would we then define the workplace is a public or private space that your work is conducted in. Any workplace communication space, any platform, social media, remote working, that is the definition of your workspace. Okay, so the Employment Equity Act 55 of 1998 speaks about the right of a person not to be discriminated against. Unfair discrimination impacts on our constitutional rights to dignity and equality. And the Employment Equity Act asserts that harassment is a form of unfair discrimination and is based on the prohibited ground that we've just gone through, your race, your gender, sex, and so forth. And that's where the code of conduct is built on top of and comes out of. So what is the definition of harassment? Harassment is the direct or indirect, single or repeated or persistent, unwanted, unsolicited conduct, advances, suggestions from one person to another. And this can be male to male, female to male, male to female. Harassment is defined in the Employment Equity Act as unwelcome conduct, suggestions, insinuations, or advances that are understood to impair your dignity. It creates a hostile environment. It creates an environment that becomes intimidating for one or other employees. It is typically calculated and it is predetermined and often induces submission by either threatening or disadvantaging the employee or the complainant. And then we define harassment by being related to one or more of the arbitrary or prohibited grounds. When we talk about who are these involved in harassment. Again, we talk about owners, employers, managers, supervisors, all employees, learners, volunteers, clients, contractors and suppliers, job seekers or applicants, interns, apprentices, and others having dealings with the business. And that also brings about a really interesting perspective in terms of, so your client comes to the office and then you are made aware of the fact that there has been an employee of yours harassed by the clients. And that's an interesting sort of path to navigate, because this is your client and your employee, and we have to protect our employees. And we'll talk about that later if the question arises, and I will cover that too. So in terms of our definition, what is unwanted conduct? And how do we identify unwanted conduct? And it's distinguished in terms of what is acceptable conduct in the workplace. What would we deem as from a reasonable person, the most logical conduct and manner in which to behave in the workplace? And there are two primary issues that arise in evaluating whether the harasser knew or should have known that the conduct wasn't welcome. So has the complainant communicated, whether verbally or non-verbally, to the perpetrator, whether it was a no or whether it was a sort of shaking of the head or walking away or sort of a grimace. If there was no communication, we need to examine whether or not the perpetrator knew or should have known that his behavior was considered to be unacceptable in the workplace. And this, of course, needs to be investigated objectively always. And even typically when an employee has a history, we cannot have a predetermined idea of what we perceive has occurred. We need to investigate the matter thoroughly. And from the perspective of the complainant, I understand too that we deal in a multicultural space, and very often customs and norms are already established in the workplace, and behaviors may already be established in the workplace, but that doesn't typically or position that behavior is acceptable. And if you find that the workplace uses abusive language typically and is comfortable with abusive language, then it possibly is a good idea to create an environment where that is not the norm, and create an awareness that this is perhaps not the norm in a working environment, purposely because you may have a new engagement coming on board who may take offense or take umbrage to what now is this established norm and an established way of communicating. There's also the other side of the coin where cultural behaviors may take offense more easily. For example, a line manager may take an offense to an employee who doesn't make eye contact. So that needs to be navigated as well in terms of what are the norms in the workplace and what is accepted as the norm. Single or repeated. Harassment may occur as a result of a pattern of persistent conduct or a single event. So your classic secretary that's harassed perhaps on a daily basis, little jokes here and there, inappropriate touching, and doesn't say anything. Or a single event, once off, that occurs. Both need to be dealt with objectively, and even if the matter has happened over a period of time, that doesn't preclude the complainant from addressing and seeking comfort from the employer now at this point, or making a decision to to raise the matter. The once-off is event or of a serious nature is determined in the light of how the employee perceives the incident. And again, that needs to be investigated objectively. You cannot assume that because someone, another employee, a colleague, made a sort of joke, an inappropriate joke once off, that it didn't affect another employee very badly. Obviously, you need to see it in perspective. However, you need to address it and investigate it and create an environment where you are preventing and eliminating harassment. So you have to see it from the complainant's perspective. So how do you establish, the situation? So let's see what the context of the harassment is. What is the context of the harassment? The circumstances of the employee. You may find in some instances an employee may be battling financially, and then because of that situation be taken advantage of. What is the impact on the employee? Some employees brush it off, they move on quite quickly, and they show quite a hard front. Other employees take it quite badly, it affects their employment, and they start incurring disciplinary warnings, and they find themselves in a bit of a difficult situation in the workplace, trying to work through what's happened to them. And also, what is the position of the complainant and the perpetrator? Is it a line manager to an employee? Is it the other way around? Are they both on the same level? And that's very interesting as well in terms of your investigation, because and that's important, because the line manager situation is creating a situation of submission and threats, intimidation, where perhaps from an employee to a line to be investigated thoroughly from an objective perspective. There are types of harassment: psychological harassment, which is your emotional harassment; your verbal harassment, which is your snide jokes, your racist comments; physical, which is an actual physical attack on the employee. Conduct in the workplace, which may constitute as harassment. And that's where we see the code has now broadened its definition, and it is all-encompassing but not limited to these, which is your slandering, spreading malicious rumors, ostracizing. Conduct that humiliates or assaults or demeans an employee, group of people, withholding work-related information, providing incorrect information, sabotaging, obstructing work performance, demotion without justification, disciplinary action without substance, intolerance to a medical or psychological condition or circumstance, and as I said, selective disciplinary action from the workplace. So let's look at and dig into sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, as a definition, is unwanted conduct, unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature that violates the rights of the employee. Harassment is linked to prohibited grounds, as we spoke about earlier in terms of our Employment Equity Act and what it provides, and it's based on the employee's sex and or gender and or sexual orientation. Whether the sexual conduct was unwanted or unwelcome, and we spoke about it becomes unwanted and unwelcome when the complainant takes offense to it. Something changes, and now they are almost stopped in their tracks in terms of what has happened. The nature and extent of the sexual conduct and the impact of the unwelcome conduct on the employee in the workplace. Becomes sexual harassment if the behavior is persistent and even a single act constitutes as sexual harassment. And where the victim made it known that the conduct was offensive. We understand that in some instances, the complainant may not have made it known to the perpetrator. However, that doesn't preclude her or him, and the complainants must still immediately after, as soon as possible, raise the harassment with their human resources or their line manager or someone they are able to, in a senior position that they're able to discuss this with. Harassment may take place under the following circumstances: sexual favors, favoritism, quid pro quo, view of services, a person's influence in terms of business processes. You will get that promotion if you do X, Y, Z. Again, sexual harassment interferes with work performance. It intimidates the employee, and it creates an environment that becomes hostile and intolerable. Sexual harassment includes, but is not limited to, unwanted physical conduct, inappropriate touching, sexual assault, strip search by an opposite sex or observed by the opposite sex. It is in the form of verbal, suggestive remarks, insinuation, sex-related jokes and insults, cat whistles directed at a person, persistent requests to go on dates or sexual favors, and social media communication of a sexual nature. The unwanted, the non-verbal forms would then be your unwelcome gestures, indecent exposure, display of explicit material, an inappropriate picture on a screensaver, for example. So in terms of how does one report sexual harassment? You know, what do you do? And we often say that my first port of call is to create an awareness in the workplace. That starts with the Employment Equity Committee, ensure that everyone in the Employment Equity Committee is trained up. Those are your representatives. Then train up your line managers to understand how to deal with sexual harassment. What is the process? Who do they contact? How do they comfort the employee? What is their first point of departure? Make sure that you have your policies and procedures in place, your grievance procedure in place that is accessible and easily understood by an employee. Then in terms of the actual reporting, the incident must be reported immediately. To HR, to a line manager, to a senior person. Consult with both parties. The HR manager is to consult with both parties and investigate the matter with discretion. The matter must be kept confidential. And typically what happens when there is harassment or sexual harassment in the workplace, there are employees who become aware of it. You obviously want to try and prevent it becoming a workplace gossip, because you want to protect both parties and be able to create an environment that prevents and eliminates harassment in the workplace. The complainants must be advised of what action can be taken. You need to advise the complainants of the informal process and the formal process, and the decision of which avenue to take must be taken by the complainant. The employer can still pursue, should they feel it necessary, based on the evidence that has been brought about through the investigation. They can pursue procedure, which then would be the grievance process and your disciplinary action when necessary. Typically, the informal process starts with your roundtable, your mediation. You get both parties together and have the discussion about the incident, and obviously determine what the outcome is of the complainant. And because of the seriousness of the harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace, there's advocated that this is done within 3 days, that action is taken by the employer within 3 days of the initial complaint that was raised. Should we arrest in the informal space and subsequent to the roundtable mediation, the perpetrator must be educated and counseled on the offensive behavior. Obviously, if the complainant has erred in this way before, the company needs to investigate, a more formal process in terms of how to address this with the perpetrator. And counselling must be offered to the complainant. And this is by a third party, a professional who is able to support the complainant through dealing with the matter, in order that he or she can climb back on the horse and get back into the workspace more easily. The code speaks about the obligations of the employer. And what are the obligations of the employer? So the obligations of the employer is to do an objective investigation, conduct a risk assessment, consult with both parties, and ensure that both parties have thrashed out where they're both comfortably able to move through this, if that is where the complainant is wanting to go. The informal process will be a roundtable. A formal process then would see the employer adopting the grievance and disciplinary process. The disciplinary action obviously will be taken in line with the code, and the company needs to ensure that the sexual harassment policy, the harassment policy, speaks to zero tolerance in the workplace and work towards preventing an elimination. And that is done by way of ensuring your people are aware of what harassment is. They're aware of what is acceptable conduct in the workplace. How can we behave? Yes, this is our culture, this is our norm when we're at home, but that may not necessarily be acceptable workplace behavior. It also offers the racial, ethnic, and social origin harassment, and the two areas that it focuses more on, and that is sexual harassment, which we've covered, and then racial, ethnic, and social origin harassment. Racial harassment is a form of harassment and is defined as abusive language, racist jokes, cartoons or memes, including communication that amounts to hate speech. Offensive racial material, online harassment, racist name calling or negative stereotyping, offensive behavior, creating a hostile environment for a person or group of people of ethnic origin in the workplace, subtle or blatant exclusions from workplace interactions, activities, other forms of marginalization, unthreatening behavior which intimidates a person and creates an environment that is hostile and intolerable to work in. Again, we look at what are the factors. It impairs dignity. It creates an environment that is hostile and intolerable for one or more employees. It is calculated and impacts on the employees' performance and impacts on the employees' conduct. And that's where we always go back to. What is the impact on the employee, and how is it impacting on the work performance, and are they able to continue performing in the workplace? In terms of the obligations of the employer, which I've briefly covered, I just want to cover this in terms of a summary. And we see the code saying that we need to take proactive and remedial steps to prevent harassment and unfair discrimination in the workplace in line with the Employment Equity Act. The code speaks about zero tolerance. It talks about conducting a risk assessment in the workplace. What are the potential possibilities of harassment existing in the workplace? What is the employer going to do to prevent this from happening moving forward? How is the employer going to deal with workplace harassment? Are the employer's policies, grievance processes, disciplinary action processes and procedures accessible to all employees, those both online, on the shop floor, in a factory, in an office? Can everyone access and understand how an employee, a complainant, can reach out and contact someone and lay a grievance, make someone aware of them being harassed in the workplace? We spoke about an harassment policy. We spoke about the grievance procedure. To ensure that the grievance procedure is accessible, it provides steps, easy steps for an employer or employee, the complainant, to follow in order to have the matter resolved. The steps must be accessible in a way that doesn't take 24 days for resolve. It must be done over the shortest possible time in a confidential space. And then, of course, is the company disciplinary code and procedure in a factory, in an office, able to understand it, able to understand what can be the outcomes, and the approach of the company, which is zero tolerance to harassment in the workplace. It is the obligation of the employer to create a workplace that is safe, that eliminates and prevents and eliminates hostility, and eliminates an environment that is intolerable for employees to work in. It is the obligation of the employer to create an awareness and communicate the code to its employees, and offer support and counseling to those employees, to the complainants that have been affected by harassment. What is the procedure? So it is the obligation of the employer to ensure that all parties are consulted with, take the necessary steps to eliminate the harassment. Once the employer is aware of the complaint or the matter, that the employer advises the complainant of what steps can be followed, what they can access to bring resolve. That there is an formal process and there's an informal process. And if they choose to take the informal process, what would that mean? If they choose to take the formal process, what would that mean? It needs to be explained to the complainant in a way that they can understand it. the complainant needs to be offered support and counseling and advice on which avenue to select. The complainant can change their mind, but they need to be provided with objective support and not support that is easier for the employer to adopt. This needs to be seen from the perspective of the complainant and dealt with in a way that would keep the complainant intact and back in the workforce performing as normal. And obviously the steps, the employer needs to follow the steps that are procedurally and substantively.
Khalid, from what you're saying, I can really hear how broad-based harassment is. And I think what's really standing out for me is how obviously it comes back to the individual and what they perceive as being harassment, which has a whole lot of definitions for different people. But I also, perhaps you want to comment.
Yeah, sorry, Gail, that's so hard with when you're in a virtual space, hey, at the start and stop. But, you know, Gail, absolutely. And that's why we have to go back to what the rational person does in the workplace. Is it rational? Considering cultural norms, considering beliefs that every individual has and brings to the workplace, as an employer, our stance is we need to consider what the rational and most logical behavior is. And that needs to be our point of departure, because we can very easily become quite subjective in terms of, oh, well, that's the norm and that's acceptable. But what is acceptable to me may not necessarily be acceptable to you, Gail, and you know, vice versa. So we need to see it from a very logical and rational perspective.
Definitely, it's very easy when it's obvious and when it's clear. It's when you get to more subtle lines as that it becomes more difficult. But I think then it goes back to what you were saying, that there should be zero tolerance. So as soon as anyone oversteps that mark, where is your line? So I think it goes also back to a company having clear policies and guidelines in place, and also training of everybody. So it's not only awareness of what harassment is, but how other people would perceive harassment. So training in the workplace is really, really important and essential in understanding what the code is saying and how this applies in the workplace to all employees. So those gray areas where people might have thought some behavior was okay, for example, like a wolf whistle, it could still be considered offensive to other members of staff.
And some people might giggle about it and brush it off in some workplaces, but others, but is it acceptable and is it right? No, it's not. And that's why we also, in our awareness, in our creating awareness, is what are we doing in terms of correcting the behavior? Yes, we can create an awareness, we can create, you know, we can tell everyone in our place of work, you know, you can't send rumors, you don't, you know, it's not a good idea to be rumor mongers and, you know, gossip, and that's considered harassment. But what is the corrective behavior? So the corrective behavior would, if you have a problem in the workplace with a colleague, or you have heard something that is you found to be upsetting, raise it with your line manager. You know, so you have to balance it off, because very often we do tell our people, you can't do this, you can't do that, but then what can we do? And create an environment of corrective behavior, creating an awareness of because also a lot of workplaces don't, you know, it's a norm to laugh and joke and send this joke around and send a little WhatsApp on a group message, and you find that one person has now, you know, taken offense to a joke on a WhatsApp group. That it's not acceptable. It's not a deemed acceptable workplace behavior, and that is the corrective behavior. What is acceptable workplace, and that behavior goes hand in hand with this awareness.
When we were chatting yesterday, we said, well, what happens? You know, what is the process? And you know, so somebody wants to go to the CCMA, but we also commented, which I think is relevant also to the previous point, if at what point does it become a legal matter? And you know, where is the line between handling something at work and feeling the necessity that you need to bring in a lawyer, or it has to become a police case. I think also you commented that most of what you apply and know, you check and have a legal foundation for that. So perhaps you want to comment further on that.
Thanks, Gail. Yes, you know, we are supported by Stuart attorneys, and you know, they support us in terms of the legal content that, and our legal support. And you know, this space, you can't brush a single incident off because you perceive it to just be, oh, this was that. You know, it's really, it's about how the complainant has dealt with it. So it's very important to have a legal eye. So Stuart's attorneys are sort of, do acknowledge and want to recognize them in this, because they are our legal arm to this. But I think what is very important, just to go back to your question, Gail, on, you know, what is the turning point, and it really is where an employer has not sought resolve. It is the obligation of the employer to ensure that they have prevented and eliminated it. And if there is no elimination, there's no resolve. If the complainant is still in a space of I'm not comfortable, I don't believe that this really has resolve the matter for me, I'm not reconciled. They believe that they have you know, exhausted all the ventilation you know, areas that an organization offers and disciplinary processes. That's when the turning point is to, okay, now let's seek feel that, you know, the employee feel that the employee has not protected them. And it's serious relationship severing when it gets to that point. It's serious morale, undermining and effects on the morale, and not only of the employee or the complainant, but the entire workplace is now become aware of this. They're aware that this person has, you know, raised the matter at the CCMA. And now, what does that look like moving forward for their employee or the complainant? How do they come back to the workplace and work in this environment? Is it tolerable? So you really don't want to get there. So as an organization, your every focus should be on preventing, eliminating, and ensuring that this has the quickest resolve in line with what and how the complainant seeks resolve.
Thanks, Colette. You've really had a huge topic to cover, and I really would urge anyone listening or people who listen in the future to, if they have any questions, to make contact with you, because I'm sure that you can provide more assistance and guidance on this topic. And I think for me, my takeaways is that harassment is a huge field. And it really goes back to what's important. The basis of it is creating equality and equity in the workplace. And we have to really emphasize that that's the overall goal, that everybody feels equal and is treated the same within a workplace environment, to make sure that you have policies in place and procedures in place, that everybody understands that there's zero tolerance for any harassment in the workplace. And then to go from there, because as soon as you have gray areas, it becomes very problematic. And if you say zero, then it's easy to understand. But much easier said than done, because of all of our cultural, all the implications.
I mean, it really is. You know, just going back to the questions and answers, Gail, it's quite tricky to answer a lined question, and you know, I invite people to contact me, because sometimes you want to explore the question more, but time doesn't allow. You know, certainly where the person's working remotely and now family members harassing them, and I'd love to have that conversation with the person and dig in deeper and how and where and what, but obviously, you know, we just don't have that time. But Gail, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, you know, to everyone who attended this webinar. I hope you were able to take something away and use it in line with the code. Thank you.
Thanks, Colette. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.